Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire.
In June 1940, Britain faced what would be its darkest military moment. Hundreds of thousands of troops of the Allied Expeditionary Force had been rescued from the beaches of Dunkirk, but thousands had been left behind. The brutal campaign in the air over France had exposed the fragilities of the RAF's frontline aircraft.
We were jumped by Me-109s, came out of the sun above us, and we hadn't seen them, but unfortunately, right at the last moment, someone did see them, so they shouted out, "Break, break," down sort of thing, because there's no point in standing hanging around, because they were coming down behind us.
With British ground forces in Europe either killed or captured, and the surviving troops battle-weary and under-equipped in the UK, the Prime Minister summed up the inevitable.
The Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be freed, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands.
On the beaches of Dunkirk, the cry had been, "Where the hell is the RAF?" The grim reality was that the RAF were struggling to get as many aircraft as they could airborne. And whilst protecting the beaches was important, aerial cover and counter-attack was critical further inland from the French coast, as the British Expeditionary Force and the French Army fought to protect the routes to the beaches in a rearguard action. What should have been set-piece ground support operations for the Air Force turned into an aerial massacre, as the deficiencies of equipment, training and tactics cost the RAF precious pilots' lives.
The RAF sent fairy battles, Bristol Blenheims, Lysanders into combat, and they had even, at one stage, taken Gloucester Gladiators to France, completely and utterly outclassed by the German Me-109. The price paid by the courageous crews using ferry battles to try and target bridges and canals and German advancing columns was horrendous.
I was very lucky. We used to bomb across and bomb up and down on a certain stretch of road. That was our patch. And then we came back, and the thing is to get back. That was the answer. Because otherwise, if you'd seen anything and you told, you couldn't tell anybody if you were shot down. So you had to get back. Because if anything, we saw ships, we shot at them. If we saw anything else, we got pushed off as fast as we could. Those were in Blenheims.
The final heartbreaking humiliation for the RAF came when 800 of their experienced servicemen, having supported the BEF evacuation, tried desperately to get back to Britain on SS Lancastria, only for the ship to be targeted and sunk by the merciless Luftwaffe.
One soldier serving with the Royal Norfolk Regiment, who witnessed the tragic end of the Lancastria, was Albert McLachlan, my father, a sniper who was one of those who fought retreated, fought and retreated as they tried to stem the German advance. And he never forgot, having reached what he thought was the safety of a British destroyer, being rescued, and then seeing not far away the Stukas hurtling out of the skies onto the helpless Lancastria. The bombs departing from the Stukas, to him, seemed to almost go down the funnel of the Lancastria, the explosion, and then heeling over and taking to the bottom hundreds of vitally needed airmen and riggers and fitters for the RAF.
In London, Churchill faced a stark situation. At the height of the Battle of France, virtually the same number of aircraft were being destroyed on a daily basis as were being manufactured. Between the 19th of May and the 1st day of June, 453 aircraft of all types were added to the British inventory, but 436 were lost in combat. Many of those, the new frontline types, Spitfires and Hurricanes, which at least stood a chance against their much-vaunted German counterpart. The much-needed replacements were being constructed by any British factory that could handle the assembly and engineering required, and the men and women on those production lines were every bit as vital as any pilot.
I was put in the skins, actually onto the leading edge, onto the skeleton, you know.
Two of my friends were killed on nights the month before I started. It's the curved edge of the wing that goes right to the tip.
Two ladies was riveted in the top skin.
And of course a girl can get their arm in where the men couldn't, and then you held it while the other girl drilled it.
They got so used to doing the job, I don't think men could keep up with them.
We must have done about 10 or 12 a day, I think.
I had the occasion to talk to him without any other company. And I told him we will have the opportunity to attack London when London is covered by fog, and we can fly with everything we have ready, even with the Junker 52, like we did in Warsaw. And he said, stop it, stop it. I don't want to hear this. The whole attack on England is against my opinion, against my willing. I could stop it. The English population is of such high class, and they are so similar to the Germans that I hate to fight England.
The RAF were desperately short of experienced pilots of their own, but held one significant trump card. Unknown to the Luftwaffe, there were hundreds of battle-hardened Polish and Czech pilots who, having seen their homelands fall and having fought with the French Air Force against the German invaders, were only too eager to have another crack at the Nazis. But first, they had to make it safely to England.
So the authorities decided that we'll finish our training. So we went partly by bus, partly by cars, partly on foot to the Romanian frontier. About 160 reached England.
I made my way to France, a very roundabout way, but I finally made it. The first fighter we had was Moran, which was a clunker. It was a modern aircraft, retractable gear, cannon firing through the hub. It was a solid aircraft, no question about it, but it was definitely not a match for 109.
Because of the obvious differences in language and flying experience, the Poles and the Czechs were grouped together in their own special squadrons under the control of the RAF.
Started as the most junior pilot officer. But after 2 years in 315, whilst in 315, I was a flight commander. And from then, I was promoted to command 308 Squadron. Eventually, I was appointed the squadron commander of 317 Squadron. And I commanded that squadron for the best part of 43.
The biggest problem that the Polish pilots had, I'm sorry to say it, but it is perhaps understandable, was what my father said was an extraordinary lack of fighting spirit among their French equivalents. But What it meant was that Krasnodębski, who commanded 303 Squadron at Northolt, his first commander, recounts how he and a group of Polish officers were in the mess having lunch on a French base. Someone ran in to say enemy aircraft were approaching the airfield. Every Pole got to his feet and ran for the aircraft. The French commander stayed sitting down and said, "What are you hurrying for? We haven't finished lunch yet." There were about 8,500 Polish airmen had reached Britain by the start of the Battle of Britain. That's pilots, ground crew, mechanics, intelligence, admin, everything that goes with a complete air force.
I met another people from Air Force. They all organized that they will go away and fight abroad. So when you come to England, that was 12 July 1940, and I was with a squadron to the end. It was a nice place, Oxford.
It's said very often in the great cliches that in 1940 Britain stood alone. It didn't. It still had one and only one ally, Poland. Poland was the only country which was invaded and occupied by the Germans, which did not, at the end, surrender, did not sign an armistice, never did a deal. It said, no, we're still at war with you. The government moved out. Those naval units that got to Britain did. Tens of thousands of its soldiers got to Britain, and 8,500 airmen. That was effectively a sovereign air force. And that was one of their first problems, because the RAF's idea was, they're quite simple, boys, you just swear this oath to King George and we put you in the airplanes. I'm terribly sorry. We've already sworn an oath to the President of the Republic of Poland, and he's now in London, and we can't unswear it. And there's a bit of sort of civil service MOD head-scratching at this, and eventually it was realised, well, yes, all right, it's the Polish Air Force. It'll fly under the operational control of the RAF, but we recognise their integrity as an Air Force, which is why, although they used the basic RAF uniform, the wings were Polish wings. The rank badges, they had Polish rank badges as well as RAF rank badges.
The countries of the British Commonwealth were also gearing up to enter the air war.
Down there is one of Canada's great training centres for the RAF. Less than a year ago, just a plan. Today, a reality where each year thousands of men win their wings under ideal conditions.
But the one untapped area of human resources was the USA. Officially neutral, it was left to a committee of German Americans opposed to Hitler, the Clayton Knight Committee, to establish a back door to enable US pilots to join the fight. Among them was American-Greek émigré Steve Pisanos.
Then through a friend who I think he was not an employee or an agent of the British, but he had connections with some people, through the Clayton Knight Committee. In other words, listen, you guys, the Clayton Knight Committee, would tell these people, listen, you guys, you need American pilots. See if you can find people who would be interested to join the RAF and fight the Germans. So he told me, he said, do you really want to fight the Germans? We're up there in the front. So he says, how about joining the RAF?
A lot of young guys like me, unencumbered with a little bit of flying time and wanted to get more, and didn't tell us anything about getting shot at. I went up to Canada and interviewed the recruiting officer. That was in 1939, and I spent about an hour talking to them, and they said, yeah, we want you. I went through a ground school, then I went on an airplane called the Tiger Moth, which is like a small Beechcraft Stearman, and we got about 60 or 80 hours in that, and that was the beginning. That was called primary. Then I graduated from that school. I went on to an airplane called the Harvard, which is the equivalent to the AT-6 that we use in our Air Force, and I flew about 80 or 90 hours in that. And then I got my wings and commission. And then I was all set to go over to England to fly Spitfires.
My friend had told me, he says, they'll take you. They need everyone they can get. Even so you're not an American, they'll take you. Greece is member of the alliance, they'll take you.
By the time the battle looked inevitable, British manufacturing had managed to gear up and was producing 300 new fighters a week. The problem was that fewer than 200 pilots were qualifying from basic training in the same period, and even if they were able to take to the air, they would have proved easy prey for the marauding Luftwaffe.
I think the tragedy was there were a lot of young people who had just finished their training and were thrust into this without any prior experience, and in some cases, I remember an instance when a pilot delivered a new aircraft to us. There was a mad scramble, they refueled it, and he took off and was shot down, and to this day, we never found out who he was.
Of even greater concern was the early combat performance of the Hawker Hurricane and the then brand new Spitfire Mark I. Up against the Messerschmitt 109, which Air Ministry bosses anecdotally regarded as no better than average, the RAF found themselves deeply disadvantaged. The German type flew faster, straight and level, dived without hesitation, and was heavily and effectively armed with both machine guns and 20mm cannon.
The Me-109 was, the Germans hoped, and almost became a war-winning fighter. It matched and outclassed the Hurricane. It was a match for the Spitfire. It was faster. It could dive straight into a dive with direct fuel injection, which the Merlin engine did not have. The Merlin was carburetor, which had problems when tipped into negative G to try and chase a 109. It was an aircraft, ironically, originally fitted with a British engine to get the prototype going, and later fitted with the Daimler-Benz engines. It was a shock in some senses to the Allies. They knew it was coming. German propaganda had convinced the Allies that there was a first-class fighter here, but there were also those that were disparaging the 109. They didn't think it was as good as it turned out to be. And if you were a Hurricane pilot or a Spitfire pilot, you knew how well that aircraft could be.
So Spitfires and Hurricanes were bomber destroyers. They weren't counter-air, air superiority fighters. That's not what they were designed for. They ended up being used for that. It's not what they were designed for.
It was a hell of a bang and crash, and the cockpit got an awful mess, and I found the aircraft was suddenly nosing downwards, heading towards the sea, which was a long way away. It was I was about 16,000 feet or something at the time. It was a long way away, but it was going down fairly rapidly, and I thought, God, I better start preparing to ditch, and so I undid my belt and the straps that lock you in, and started to think about getting my feet up off the pedals and into a place where I could lever myself out into the sea. But when I got down to about 8,000 feet or something like that, I suddenly found to my surprise that the aircraft was beginning to come out of its dive, and the German chap had got pushed off home, I think, probably to tea or something, and so I started to pull it out, ease it out, and I was only about 3 or 4 miles off the coast by then. And so I eased it back and made for West Hampstead airfield, my airfield.
The Luftwaffe's reputation in the early days of the Second World War was formidable. Their fighter pilots had flown in the Condor Legion in Spain in 1936 and gained invaluable combat experience. The 109's fighting tactics had been developed and honed by the time of the Battle of Britain. Aware that it took just 4 seconds for an aircraft to be shot down, the German pilots were constantly on their guard, covering every possible angle of attack.
Most of our attacks, in order to hit the enemy, were executed from the rear. That is, you had to get behind your enemy, get between 150 yards to 100 yards, 150 yards to 200 yards. And by the time you were shooting at the enemy, who was shooting back at you, of course, from the bomber, and you're always being shot at from behind by enemy fighters who were attacking you whilst you were attacking them. So you were assailed from all sides, so to speak. And also, our 8 machine guns only had ammunition for 14 seconds, 15 seconds. We used to carry 300 rounds per gun. And it gave you 14.7 seconds of fire. So it didn't give you much opportunity to shoot a lot down, particularly when you sometimes had to hit it with 100, 150 bullets in order to make an impression on it.
The RAF's tactics and use of equipment was given a badly needed shot in the arm by the arrival on the front line of Polish and Czech pilots, who had already pitted their wits against the Luftwaffe attack squadrons. The Poles, having flown cannon-armed aircraft, were quick to spot the weakness of the Hurricane's Browning .303s and quickly came up with their own solution.
They got their aircraft at Northolt, and the first thing they did was they broke the rules, slightly cavalier Polish way. The RAF pattern was for the 8 machine guns to be aligned so that they would throw a spread of shot 12 square yards at 400 yards. Basically, the philosophy was like shooting pheasants. If you get a number of little bits in the air, with a bit of luck, one of them will hit something important. The first thing they did was recalibrate the guns. They focused on a point 150 yards in head, at which point the 303 machine gun bullets, not that effective otherwise, begin to have the power of a cannon.
I encountered my first Germans at the beginning of July with no experience at all. I flew 141 times in 16 weeks, and we were unprepared for war.
Whilst the arrival of the Polish and Czech pilots was welcomed by the RAF, the combat-hardened Eastern Europeans found that the Luftwaffe was not their only challenge.
The Poles didn't speak English. A few of them spoke French. They also found they had, as Jan Zumbach in 303 describes it, every single pilot's reflex of ours was reversed. For some reason, the British build their planes back to front. Every good Polish pilot knows that if you want to open the throttle, you pull it towards you. Unfortunately, in Britain, it has the opposite effect. Where we had litres, we now have gallons. Where we had meters per hour of climb, suddenly it's feet per minute. Every single thing has been changed. And for good measure, we now find we have folding wheels, which we didn't have on our Polish fighters. And there are 1 or 2 unfortunate accidents when the wheels weren't put down quite fast enough.
As July waned into August, the Luftwaffe realized the aircraft opposing them in the skies were not their only problem. They redoubled their efforts to destroy British radar and ground control installations. On the 12th of August, the Luftwaffe undertook raids on early warning installations in Sussex, Kent, and Ventnor on the Isle of Wight. Their efforts, however, were in vain. The RAF fighter squadrons responded with wave after wave of counterattacks and, in August, finally unleashed the Polish and Czech squadrons for their long sought-after crack at the enemy.
And they were champing at the bit. They were eager. Their hatred of the enemy was deep-rooted. The British were fighting an enemy who had not subjugated their country yet, although they wanted to. The Czechs and the Poles had loved ones, had families, had relatives, had fled everything to come and support the British.
Finally, in August 1940, the revenge-hungry Europeans could strike back at the hated Nazis. The weeks leading up to what is now known as Battle of Britain Day, on the 15th of September 1940, saw the culmination of one aerial battle and the onset of another altogether more costly aerial campaign. The Luftwaffe was preparing to throw the kitchen sink at Britain in a bid to break her morale.
I suddenly came across 2 ME-109s and my engine stopped.
And he found himself by Messerschmitt 110, which he shot down, and he said, it was unbelievably easy. I'd never had so much power, speed and armament in my hands before.
So I pulled off and I went in a flat spin. I jumped.
Yeah.
Very late. Didn't have much time.
When he got back to Northolt, he was of course publicly reprimanded by Squadron Leader Kellett for breaking orders, then publicly congratulated for shooting down the enemy. For them, it was Wyspa Ostatniej Nadziei, the island of the last hope. If Britain fell, they all knew there would be no going back for anyone ever within their foreseeable lifetimes, and Europe would be given over to Hitler's control.
But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science.
But then, just as Britain was threatening to buckle under the sheer weight of the German bombardment, the Luftwaffe made a fatal mistake, turning the focus of its attacks away from the British coastal defences and on to major towns and cities.
One of the aspects that the Germans had was this idea of hitting the capital city of a country and so devastating it that you would force capitulation as the population rose to plead with their leaders to give in. They underestimated what London could take and what Britain could take.
The nightly siege of London has begun. The city is dressed for battle. Here they come.
It happened actually before lunch, round about 11 in the morning. We'd taken off and we'd gone into this head-on attack, and we're just getting within firing range. I don't know whether I'd fired my guns or not, but nevertheless I heard this terrific bang.
Everyone asks about the fear business, and yes, I suppose one was, but one didn't sort of think of the fear part very much more than you did playing a football match at school.
One of his colleagues reported that there were enemy fighters climbing to try and get behind them, and they made a climbing attack into a descending enemy, which was the last thing they would have expected.
And it was just a general melee with 109s. We were always outnumbered, so which was pretty damn good because we didn't have to look for a target very far. I got 3 109s, and I rammed the 4th one, because in the meantime, when I was getting lined up to get the 4th one, somebody clobbered me from behind. So all of a sudden I have no air pressure for the guns, so I couldn't fire. I was so close, 50 feet behind him. So I just rammed this son of a bitch and cut off his tail. No, I didn't bail out. I just lost the prop. We had wooden props at that time. So I just lost the prop, shut off the engine, and I have altitude. And England is spitting distance away, so I was gliding, and my buddies surrounded me.
As September the 15th drew to a close, the Luftwaffe realized it had finally met its match. By the day's end, 176 enemy aircraft lay in ruins for the loss of just 25 Allied aircraft. If Britain couldn't be bombed into submission, the Germans now resolved to destroy her supply lines and targeted shipping in the English Channel in the hope of fatally wounding her.
So now the Germans are dive bombing a convoy out into sea. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's one going down on his target now. Bomb. No, missed the ships. He hasn't hit a single ship. There are about 10 ships in the convoy, but he hasn't hit a single one. You can hear our own guns going like anything now. There's a fight going on. You can hear the little rattles of machine gun bullets. That was a bomb, as you may imagine. There's another bomb dropping. Yes, it's dropped. Oh, they missed the convoy. No, they haven't hit the convoy in all this. What? Yes, oh, we just hit a Messerschmitt. Oh, that was beautiful. He's coming right down now. I think definitely that's that first contest. Absolute steep dive. Let's move round so I can watch him a bit more. Here he comes. And he's going flat into the sea, and there he goes. Smash! Oh, boy, I've never seen anything so good as this. The RAF fighters have really got these boys, Kate.
But for those in the thick of combat, it was an attritional war, in which a split second could mean the difference between life and death.
These gunners took away my sump. Smoke poured out. I switched off all my switches, fuel switched off, and I closed the engine as well, because the engine, closed the throttle and everything, because I didn't want to suck petrol in through. into the engine because part of it had gone anyway. And I came down from we were at about 18,500 feet when this happened. And I came down, it was just over the place called Caterham. And our aerodrome, Kenley, was just a few miles away as well. And I thought, well, I'd been taught to force land, and I thought, well, I'll go and land at Kenley.
And I didn't realize I was wounded. I didn't realize how bad it was. And I was losing blood. And of course, one doesn't feel pain in combat. So, and I passed out. The last transmission from me was, I'm at Angel 1, 1,000 feet, and the aircraft was well trimmed, so it continued gliding very well. No prop, to hold it back, and smashed 3 or 4 utility poles and disintegrated in the process. And that happened 500 yards from the Ramsgate General Hospital in Ramsgate, Kent. They saw it happen. I don't know that. I didn't know that.
You were unconscious?
Oh, absolutely. So they rushed out with the stretchers, dug me out. It was a freshly plowed field, luckily for me. Dug me out and put me in the morgue, which was the standard routine. Heavily wounded people, that's where they wound up.
By mid-September, the Luftwaffe's previous good reserves of aircraft were gone, with over 750 aircraft and crew lost in the month. Trained available pilots and aircraft made up less than 70% of the requirement for Me-109 squadrons. Heavy fighter bombers were at less than half strength, and spares shortages were adding to the weakness of the German assault. The RAF, meanwhile, had almost 1,300 trained pilots to hand, who were being rested and rotated in frontline action. The British had lost vast numbers of fighter aircraft, but surviving pilots were quickly back with their squadrons, and new aircraft were frequently flying straight from factories in the Midlands to operational stations. Britain was also winning the propaganda war, with the exploits of its gallant fighter aces immortalised in newsreels and romanticised by the press.
The term ace was beloved by the press, and they felt that all fighter pilots were dashing aces. And there were aces. Josef František, a Czech pilot fighting with the Poles, became an ace. An ace was an airman who shot down 5 enemy aircraft in aerial combat. And yes, the newspapers would headline the aces. They would give you stories of Sailor Milan and Bob Tuck, and on the German side, Adolf Galland. And throughout the war, these aces carried headlines.
The amazing exploits of British fighters fill the nation with pride and gratitude. Each day brings its story of daring and gallant action, of which we have tried to give you the picture. Usually this has been in the form of wrecked bombers, and on another occasion we showed you shots by camera gun located in a fighter which recorded the actual destruction of the enemy in the air. Now we're going to describe to you how the results are achieved. The success of our pilots is not just automatic. Their skill and the quality of our aircraft have combined brilliantly to evolve certain successful tactics.
We'd built up a system of defence, radar, communications and so on, so that when the battle happened we were far more prepared for what was coming than the Germans were. The Germans thought they could just come over and bomb willy-nilly. They didn't realise that we had all this radar set up. We had a great system of squadron control. So therefore when battle happened, when it started, the RAF were ready for it. That's the first thing. The second thing, I think you had a nucleus of great fighter pilots and the regulars and so on, and some of the auxiliaries, quite skilled pilots and so on, so we're ready for the battle.
I think the tension was before the scramble came, when you were just waiting and wondering what was the next move, really.
Germany's morning hate in this war takes the form of massed aerial attacks on the defences of London. So this is now a familiar sight and a familiar sound. At regular hours, the Nazi bombers come over, heavily protected by fighters. You can clearly see the Messerschmitts maneuvering above the bombers. But in spite of the number of Nazi planes, the whole nation has complete confidence in our own fighters, and with good reason.
I managed to bail out. I suppose I was about 5,000 or 6,000 feet height when I came down. When I came down, I was over the sea. When I came out of the cloud, I was over the sea, about 500 feet, and my parachute opened at that moment. Now, you don't have to be a brain surgeon to know that it would be less than 3 seconds before I hit the sea if my parachute hadn't opened. So I was that close to. I worked it out afterwards. I didn't work it out at the time.
Hurricanes come home. Our fighters land after a brisk but successful encounter with hit-and-run raiders. Here's a typical scene at one of our fighter bases between battles.
I think the big thing about it was that I was more scared going into a battle than I was afterwards. When you were committing yourself to something that you didn't know what the outcome was going to be, afterwards, however hectic it might have been, it was a matter of relief. And I think you unwound more the moment you stopped your engine on the ground. And I've seen many of the very tough pilots there breaking down and crying.
By September the 17th, the Luftwaffe losses were mounting as the battle had turned decisively in the Allies' favour. But even then, it would be a few more weeks before the German bombing raids on the RAF bases would cease completely.
These are some of the pilots, Canadians, who are daily hurling Spitfire, Hurricane or Defiant into the masses of Nazis continue to be sent against us. Hitler hoped to gain the mastery of the air, but so long as the British Empire breeds men like these, it is Britain who will gain and hold the mastery. The Fighter Command has already performed wonders, and at every alarm it gains fresh glory.
In late September 1940, the Luftwaffe made a last huge effort to penetrate Britain's defences. In what were the final 24 hours of their all-out Eagle attacks, they threw every remaining aircraft into the air to try to overwhelm the RAF's fighter squadrons.
And the Germans walked right into battle-hardened squadrons, and they were decimated. And the RAF was not supposed to exist. If they believed Beppo Schmidt's intelligence, if they believed, and they did believe, they convinced themselves that the RAF, under Göring's promise of 4 days to defeat the RAF, it ought not to be there. Why were these Hurricanes and Spitfires still reappearing? They were reappearing because the RAF was not defeated.
Individual dogfights took place within the first 30 minutes of the raid.
The Luftwaffe's last desperate throw of the dice had failed. By early October, Hitler and his High Command had lost faith in the aerial assault on Britain and were preparing to turn their attentions eastwards. The deadly aerial bombardment would continue for the rest of the war, but for now, the Battle of Britain was drawing to a close.
We could only cover a small part of the British islands, including London. But over London, as an example, we could only stay for 10 minutes to come back to our bases. So this limited range of our fighters in the escort has been perhaps the main point which avoided an effective air offensive against Britain.
The surviving pilots of the Battle of Britain went on to excel in the continued conflict, but with many lost on all sides. As the decades passed after the war, both the men and machines faded into history, an echo of the conflict past. However, at the close of the 20th century, there was a revival of interest in the aircraft that had won the Battle of Britain, with some brought back to flying status and a handful even reunited with their original pilots.
This aircraft flew into RAF Northolt for the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Britain. And my father was, of course, invited to get back into his old cockpit, which he did. He climbed in, sat down there effortlessly. The rest of us found it quite difficult when we tried, but all the muscle memory was still there. Sat down there, and because it had just been flown up by Charlie Brown, who was wearing period kit from the Goodwood Festival, the leather flying helmet was on the joystick, which is where Charlie Brown would have properly left it. And my father was just in instinctive mode, without thinking, because this is what he always did. He picked it up and put it on. And the flying helmet hid his white hair. He turned and every camera clicked. And printed in black and white, you really have to work hard to guess the date of the photograph. And if there'd been a starter trolley there, he'd have been off like a shot. I mean, unstoppable. Runway, aircraft, what more do I need? As he sat in that cockpit again, with the smells coming back, his working environment, his office, he closed the door, pulled the hood, and I watched 60 years drop off him in a moment. He was deeply moved. He loved being back in the aircraft. In fact, on almost any possible occasion when he was offered the opportunity, he was in there like a shot.
It's absolutely wonderful. This is one of the nicest birds to fly.
There was a matron, Nurse Maguire, and Nurse Maguire was a nurse in World War I, and she had seen some incredibly mutilated people who survived and did well. So every day she made a round of the morgue to see who was still breathing. Well, I was. I don't remember that, but apparently I was. So she went to the surgeon and said, well, is that boy over there? I think he needs to be taken up. So they took me up, patched me up. I don't remember any of that. I'm more dead than alive. Why bother?
They didn't bother to check out your pulse or anything?
No. This was not in the book. Military medicine is really quite cruel because the lighter wounded people are the first to be attended to. Heavily wounded are left to die unless they survive.
Which you did?
Which I did.
Good Lord.
So
how long were you convalescing for?
Oh God, I don't even want to. But I just knew I had to get back on flying status.
Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say this was their finest hour.